somewhere between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in the flat alluvial plain of southern Iraq, a civilization appeared roughly 6,000 years ago that should not have appeared where it did, in the way it did, with the sophistication it already possessed on arrival. Cities with populations in the tens of thousands, writing, mathematics, legal codes, irrigation networks engineered across hundreds of square kilometers, a pantheon, a bureaucracy, a literature. For more than a century, the working assumption in the field was that this civilization, the Sumerians, had come from somewhere else. That they had arrived in Mesopotamia already formed, carrying the seeds of urban life from a homeland further east, or from the mountains to the north, or from the Persian Gulf to the south. The sophistication was too sudden. The language belonged to no known family. The cities looked like an imposition on the landscape rather than a growth from it. That was the story. It held for generations. It has not held under what the archaeology of the last several decades has actually recovered from the ground beneath Sumerian cities. The old model is not being modified. It is being abandoned. Leonard Woolley was not the first archaeologist to dig in southern Iraq, but he was the one who set the terms of the debate. In 1922, at the ruins of Ur, he began an excavation that would run for 12 seasons and produce some of the most famous discoveries in the history of Mesopotamian archaeology: the Royal Cemetery, the lyres, the headdresses of Queen Puabi, the gold, the lapis lazuli, the carnelian brought from distances that implied trade networks stretching across the ancient world. Woolley found something else at Ur, buried far below the royal graves: a thick, sterile layer of clean silt, meters deep, with no artifacts, no bones, no cultural material of any kind. Beneath the silt, there was pottery and evidence of settlement. Above it, there was more pottery, of a different kind. Woolley interpreted the layer as the sediment left by an enormous flood, and he interpreted the change in pottery styles above and below the flood as evidence that a new population had arrived after the waters receded. Different people, different origins, a break in continuity that seemed to confirm what philologists had already suspected from the language. Sumerian did not belong to the Semitic family that surrounded it. It did not belong to the Indo-European family that would later push into the region. It did not belong to any family that could be reconstructed at all. It was, in the technical vocabulary of linguistics, an isolate, a language with no known relatives, an isolated language spoken by people who appeared to arrive after a flood in a landscape that had been occupied by someone else before them. The conclusion seemed obvious. The Sumerians had come from elsewhere. Where that elsewhere was became the great unanswered question of the 20th century in Mesopotamian studies. It was the reasonable explanation. It was wrong. The revision did not come from a single dramatic discovery. It came from the slow accumulation of evidence at sites that Woolley never excavated and could not have excavated with the methods available to him. Eridu, Tel El Oweli, Tepe Gara, Ubaid itself, the small site south of Ur that gave its name to the culture that preceded the Sumerians in the same landscape. What the excavators of these sites found, working across decades and refining their techniques with each season, was not a break. It was a continuity so precise, so unbroken, so archaeologically stubborn that the migration model could not survive its documentation. The first question any archaeologist asks when confronted with a proposed cultural break is simple. Where does the break actually appear in the physical record? At Eridu, considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the oldest city in the world, the excavations reached bedrock. The lowest levels dated to roughly 5,400 years before the Common Era. Above them, layer after layer, the site was continuously occupied for more than 3,000 years. 18 superimposed temples were identified at the same location, each rebuilt on the ruins of the last, each following the architectural logic of the one beneath it. The earliest temple was a single, small mud brick room with a niche in one wall and an offering table opposite it. The temples built above it, century after century, expanded that same arrangement. The niche became larger. The offering table became a permanent feature. The room became a complex. The complex became a monument. By the time the Sumerian city of Eridu reached its historical peak, the Temple of Enki stood on a platform raised by 3 millennia of accumulated rebuilding, and every stage of that rebuilding followed the plan of the room beneath it. There was no imposed foreign template. There was no moment when a different tradition took over. The architecture grew from itself. The pottery told the same story. The Ubaid ceramic tradition, characterized by painted geometric designs on a pale slip, evolved gradually over more than 2,000 years into the Uruk ceramic tradition, which is unambiguously Sumerian. The transition was not sudden. It was not the arrival of one style displacing another. It was the slow, traceable development of one style into the next, with every intermediate stage present in the stratigraphy. Woolley's flood layer, when re-examined with modern techniques at multiple sites, turned out to be local. A flood, yes, perhaps several floods over centuries, but not a single catastrophic event that reset the population of southern Mesopotamia. Sites only a few kilometers from Ur showed no equivalent layer. The break Woolley had identified was real at Ur. It was not real across the region. The people above the silt were the people below the silt. The excavators had expected a migration. They had not expected this. Once the continuity was established at one site, the question became whether it held everywhere. It did. At Tel el-Owali, in the deep south of Iraq, French excavators reached levels older than any known Ubaid material and found the same trajectory. Small settlements of reed and mud brick, evolving over centuries into larger villages, then into towns, then into the cities that would become the Sumerian heartland. Tel el-Owali pushed the sequence back to nearly 6,500 years before the Common Era. More than 1,000 years before Sumerian writing appears. More than 2,000 years before the first monumental architecture at Uruk. And every century of that sequence showed the same population, working the same land, refining the same techniques. The traditional model had held that agriculture came to southern Mesopotamia from the north, brought by farmers who spread down from the foothills of the Zagros and the Taurus Mountains, where wheat and barley were first domesticated. That part remained broadly correct. What the new evidence overturned was the assumption that those farmers were then displaced or overlaid by a second migration of Sumerian city builders. There was no second migration. The farmers who arrived in the alluvial plain in the 6th millennium before the Common Era were the ancestors, direct and unbroken, of the people who built Uruk and Ur and Lagash and Nippur. The urban revolution did not arrive from outside. It happened in place. The evidence for that in-place development is not only architectural and ceramic, it is agricultural, hydraulic, and demographic. Irrigation, the technology that made southern Mesopotamian civilization possible, is documented in the archaeological record as a slow accretion of small canals extending gradually outward from settlements over centuries, until they linked together into the vast networks that fed the cities. Nobody arrived with irrigation already invented. It was worked out on the ground, generation by generation, by people who were solving the specific problem of how to farm a floodplain with unpredictable rivers and no reliable rainfall. The settlements grew accordingly. Small hamlets in the 6th millennium, villages in the 5th, towns by the early 4th. By the late 4th millennium, Uruk covered more than 250 hectares and housed a population that some estimates place at 50,000 people. It was, by any reasonable measure, the largest city on Earth at the time of its peak. That trajectory does not describe an arriving people. It describes a people who had been there long enough to fill the land, to organize it, to intensify their exploitation of it, and to build institutions capable of coordinating labor on a scale that had never existed before. The obvious objection is the one the field has argued about for 100 years. If the archaeology shows continuity, what accounts for the linguistic isolation? Sumerian is not related to any other known language. If the Sumerians had been in Mesopotamia continuously from the 6th millennium onward, why does their language have no traceable ancestors and no traceable relatives? The answer, when it came, was not a discovery, but a recognition. Linguistic isolation is not evidence of geographic isolation. It is evidence of temporal isolation. Sumerian looks like a language with no relatives because all of its potential relatives died out before writing was invented. It is the last surviving member, at the moment of its documentation, of a language family that once may have covered a wide region and left no other written trace. That is not a hypothesis that can be proven with the tools currently available. Languages that were never written cannot be reconstructed from silence, but it is a hypothesis that removes the linguistic evidence from its role as proof of migration. The isolation of Sumerian is compatible with in-place development. It does not require an external homeland to explain it. Attempts to link Sumerian to other language families, to Dravidian, to Caucasian languages, to hypothetical proto-languages of Central Asia have not produced results that the field accepts. Every proposed connection has failed to survive rigorous scrutiny. That failure, over decades of trying, is itself informative. It tells the field that whatever Sumerian was related to, it was related to something that has left no other evidence. The linguistic isolate does not point to a foreign homeland. It points to an ancient one, so ancient that only Sumerian survived long enough to be written down. Ancient DNA would settle the question definitively if it could be recovered. In the climate of southern Iraq, it largely cannot. Heat, humidity in some seasons, and the chemistry of the alluvial soils are hostile to the preservation of genetic material across the timescales involved. The handful of samples that have been sequenced from Mesopotamian sites are limited, fragmentary, and mostly from later periods. What has been recovered, cautiously, tells a story consistent with the archaeology. The populations of Bronze Age Mesopotamia show genetic continuity with earlier populations of the same region and with populations of the surrounding Near East. There is no signal of a large-scale migration into southern Iraq in the period when the Sumerians supposedly arrived from elsewhere. The genetic evidence, thin as it is, does not support the traditional model. It supports what the ground has been saying for decades. The people were already there. The reconstruction of daily life in the earliest Sumerian settlements is where inference becomes essential and where the evidence has to be handled with care. What the excavations at Eridu and Tel El-Oweli and the other early sites have produced is not a narrative of daily existence, but a set of physical remains from which certain conclusions can be drawn. The reed structures were real. Their foundations survive in the mud. The marsh Arabs of southern Iraq were still building nearly identical structures into the 20th century, and the archaeological reconstructions rely on that ethnographic parallel to fill in the perishable materials that did not survive. The fish bones were real, enormous quantities of them, at every early site, showing that the population depended heavily on the aquatic resources of the marshes and the river. The clay tokens were real, small geometric shapes, thousands of them, recovered from levels centuries before the earliest cuneiform tablets. They appear to represent an accounting system, a way of tracking goods and quantities that predates writing and evolves gradually toward it. The transition from tokens to written symbols is one of the clearest documented sequences in the archaeology of writing, and it happens in southern Mesopotamia, in place over centuries. Writing was not brought to Sumer. It was invented there, in slow stages, by people who had been solving accounting problems for generations before they solved them with signs pressed into clay. The temples were real. Their sequence is unbroken. The offering tables inside them accumulated the residues of the food and drink that had been placed on them, and those residues are chemically analyzable. The population brought grain, fish, beer, and animal products to their gods across every century of the sequence. The forms of the offerings changed. The practice did not. None of this describes a foreign civilization dropped into an empty landscape. It describes a population working out, over 2,000 years, the institutions that would eventually be called Sumerian. By the late 4th millennium, the transition was complete. The city of Uruk had reached a size that had no precedent anywhere on Earth. Its temple precinct covered an area larger than most contemporary settlements in their entirety. Its writing had crossed the threshold from accounting into narrative, into the recording of names, of events, of the myths that would eventually be written down as the oldest literature humanity possesses. The people who did this were the descendants of the villagers of Tel el-Awali. They were the descendants of the temple builders of Eridu. They were the descendants of the fishermen and farmers who had been living in the marshes of southern Iraq for 2,000 years before Uruk existed. They were not immigrants. They were natives in the deepest possible sense of that word. Their civilization was the accumulated work of their ancestors, layered century by century into the ground beneath their feet. There is a temptation at moments like this to romanticize what the evidence describes. To imagine the early Sumerians as a peaceful agricultural people gradually building a great civilization through cooperation and ingenuity. The evidence does not support that reading either. The city of Uruk, at the moment of its greatest expansion, appears to have projected its influence outward with a force that the archaeological record still struggles to explain. Uruk-style pottery, Uruk-style architecture, and Uruk-style administrative practices appear suddenly at sites hundreds of kilometers to the north in what is now Syria and eastern Turkey in the late 4th millennium. Some of these sites appear to have been established as colonies. Others show evidence of violent destruction at approximately the moment of Uruk contact. The mechanism has been debated for decades. Trade, colonization, military expansion, ideological export, the evidence is compatible with several of these interpretations and with combinations of them. What is not in doubt is that the expansion happened and that it happened outward from southern Mesopotamia, not inward into it. The Sumerians, in the moment of their emergence as an identifiable urban civilization, were already exerting pressure on the world around them. The peaceful in-place development of the Ubaid period did not remain peaceful. Something in the transition from village to city carried with it the capacity for large-scale coercion, and that capacity was applied. Inside the same civilization that invented writing to keep track of grain offerings, colonies were being planted and settlements were being burned. Both things were true simultaneously. They always are. The old model was clean. A foreign people arrived, built cities, invented writing, and set the pattern for everything that followed. It had the shape of an origin story, and origin stories are easy to teach. The new model is harder. It requires 2,000 years of continuous occupation before the first city appears. It requires the invention of urban life to be attributed not to a moment of arrival, but to a slow accumulation of institutions across dozens of generations. It requires the acceptance that the sophistication of Sumer was not imported from anywhere. It was built by people who had been living in the same landscape long enough to build it. That is a less dramatic story. It is also based on the evidence, the true one. The archaeological continuity from Ubaid to Uruk is now documented at multiple sites, across multiple techniques, by multiple national and international expeditions. The pottery sequence is unbroken. The architectural sequence is unbroken. The settlement sequence is unbroken. The agricultural and hydraulic sequences are unbroken. The genetic evidence, incomplete as it is consistent with continuity. The linguistic evidence, once its role as proof of migration is set aside, is compatible with continuity. There is no gap. There is no arrival. There is only the deepening of a presence that had been in the land for 2,000 years before Sumer became Sumer. What the discovery of that continuity did not close is the question of where the Ubaid population itself came from. The trail runs back into the earlier Neolithic of the Near East, into the spread of agriculture out of the Fertile Crescent, into populations that were themselves the descendants of hunter-gatherers who had been in the region for tens of thousands of years. The Sumerians are not the endpoint of that trail. They are a chapter in it. The methodological consequence of the last several decades of work in southern Mesopotamia is not simply that one civilization has been reclassified from immigrant to native. It is that the assumption of migration as the default explanation for cultural change has been weakened across the entire field. When sophistication appears in the archaeological record, the first question is no longer where it came from. The first question is, what was already there? The excavations at Eridu began nearly a century ago. The excavations at Tel El Oweli began decades later. The synthesis of what those sites showed took longer still, because it required the accumulation of enough parallel evidence to make continuity undeniable rather than merely plausible. The work is not finished. New sites are still being identified. Older excavations are being reanalyzed with techniques that were not available when they were first dug. The oldest name of the oldest city in the world, according to the Sumerians themselves, was Eridu. In their own mythology, kingship first descended from the heavens onto Eridu, and from there it moved to the other cities of the plain. They were not describing a foreign arrival, they were describing a local origin. They did not know that the excavations of the 20th and 21st centuries would confirm the outline of their own memory, that the temple at the heart of their city had stood in one form or another on the same spot for 3,000 years before their civilization was named, that the people who built the first small shrine of mud brick in the 6th millennium were their ancestors in an unbroken line, that when they said Eridu was the beginning, they were, in the terms the archaeology now understands, correct. They were not a people who came from somewhere else. They were a people who came from where they were, which is the same thing that has always been true of every population that has ever built anything worth remembering. The land held them for 2,000 years before they became visible to history, and it has held their evidence for 8,000 years since. We just needed the right techniques to read what was already in the ground.